All right, so after looking at the Battle of Antietam, hopefully at this point we can gauge a little bit more of why Antietam would be such an important element of the creation, the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, so let's look at some of the history, the background of the Emancipation Proclamation, what emancipation really means, how we can define it, because it's really important in terms of how Lincoln comes to the decision finally, because it's not always in favor of this decision to actually issue the Emancipation Proclamation. All right, so we've heard the lines hopefully of Lincoln saying if he could preserve the Union by freeing all the slaves, paraphrasing, free all the slaves, free some of the slaves, free none of the slaves, he would do it because of course his first and biggest priority is to preserve the Union, is to keep the Union together, whatever that means, is to keep the Union together. Of course, we know that he also is against slavery. I mean, as a presidential candidate, he did speak of not wanting to, harm or touch slavery where it existed, but he was in favor of doing away with the idea of having slavery, let's say in the West, for example. So we know that he is not in favor of slavery, but he wasn't, at least as a presidential candidate, willing to stake his reputation on getting rid of it everywhere. Okay, so let's look at it. So Northern soldiers have been bringing back tales of seeing slaves building military earthworks, doing everything from building bridges, building roads, repairing roads for the Southern war cause. I mean, just the idea, and I say here, that slaves are working on plantations while whites are then able to fight is aiding in the war cause to a certain degree. Okay, so as long as they're assisting the economy of the war or the war cause in general, the South, the Confederacy, whites, I'm sorry, I'm reading this here, but Northerners are going to feel that is, to some Northerners, Lincoln maybe, right, would feel that this is a reason why slaves should be emancipated because they're being used as weapons, as elements of war making for the South, is really what it comes down to. So, but Lincoln always stated that his intention should be, his intention was not to interfere with slavery where it currently exists, as I said before. So how does this change? Well, you have a couple of different things. You have the Confiscation Acts, July 1862, right? So what this means, and there's two of them, right? One actually in 1861. The one in 1862, though, is the really, really big one. So the one in 1861 just basically defines what can be confiscated. But in 62, it really brings slaves into the element of what's called contraband, something that can be confiscated because it is being used for the Southern war effort. So it orders the seizure of land from disloyal Southerners and the emancipation of their slaves. This actually, and what I mean by this in parentheses is where it says this had a very wide scope, even to the point of simply paying taxes. Even if Southern blacks, were having taxes paid as a result of holding slaves, which are property, so they would be taxed, would include them being a contribution to the war effort, because those tax dollars are going to go to fund the war effort. So of course they're being taxed. I mean that's the nature of property. Property is taxed. That's what happens. But basically what this is saying is that yes, you can confiscate slaves. They are part of the war effort on the part of the South, and so they can be confiscated. That's what this is basically saying. Now Lincoln originally was not in favor of this. In fact, John C. Fremont, formerly and famously known as the man who basically conquered California for the United States, made the Bear Flag Republic, and then eventually it's acquired, compromised in 1850 or annexed into the United States, the Free State. As a general, Fremont that is, as a general during the Civil War, was freeing slaves. He was actually doing this. He was confiscating and freeing them, and Lincoln told him not to. Okay, and one of the reasons why Lincoln told him not to was that those people in the border states felt threatened by this. Because remember, the border states still had slavery, they just remained loyal to the Union. So they felt very threatened by this. So what happened was you had an idea that was not very popular at the time, with a lot of people. And Lincoln, having to maintain war footing, even war footing depending on who he's speaking to as a politician, realized that maybe it wasn't ready. The world, the country, the North, whoever we're talking about, war, let's say, wasn't ready to free all the slaves. But when this heavily radical Republican Congress, or a very progressive Congress, I mean, this Congress is making Lincoln look like a very conservative guy, actually. And Congress approves of these confiscation acts. What he sees is a softening of this. And he sees that, well, now maybe I can do this. But even after that, he realizes that he can't just emancipate all the slaves. And he might not even be able to emancipate all the slaves in the Deep South yet. And it's William H. Seward, the Secretary of State, who is a big-time abolitionist and actually might have been president himself, if not for his aggressively abolitionist mindset in the 1850s, who says, you can do this, Mr. President, you can do this, you should do this, but you really need a battlefield victory first. This is just too debatable right now. You need momentum on your side. And the United States, the Union North, as the Union, we're still calling it, of course, that's remained loyal, needs a battlefield victory. We haven't really had a big battlefield. We haven't had a turning point. With Antietam, that's what comes. Antietam is such a shift because of that. Okay, or this whole idea is a shift because of Antietam, we should say. So, despite resentment of white workers afraid that they may lose jobs to freed men, as we'll call emancipated slaves, and those who thought the war would just become about slavery and the abolitionist cause, Lincoln proclaimed the slaves in the seceded states in the Deep South to be free because they were viewed as contraband, aiding the Confederate war effort as we described in the first slide, the second slide. He did not free the slaves in the border states or those areas already under federal occupation. So he is literally only freeing slaves that are in rebellious places. Okay? So this is the same guy who we've called into question for doing things that may not be constitutional, and the Southerners have called a tyrant because he's overstepped his bounds in the Constitution. He is saying, he's actually restraining himself and saying, I can't free all these slaves because I can only do that in places where the war is ongoing. Even in places in the Deep South, but where federal Union forces, federal forces have taken back or conquered part of those those part of the southern region, he feels he can't emancipate them because they're actually under the federal authority now. They're not actually in rebellion anymore. So it's only where rebellion is happening. Okay, so he felt legally he had no right to do this, right? To abolish slavery is what I was just saying. And he would wait for a battlefield victory in order to accomplish this politically. And the reality is that it's, again, as we said, Antietam. So impacts at home and abroad. Okay. Right, most Southerners are outraged. I think we would assume that they would be outraged, right? Some, like Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, feel it will inspire the South. Either way, so he's trying to look for some of the positive, silver lining in this. Either way, they all feel Lincoln to be an abusive tyrant. So this has not changed the Southern view of Lincoln. He is still overstepping his bounds. Even though Lincoln feels he's acting within the confines of the U.S. Constitution, the Union Constitution, of course they're going to look towards it through a different perspective, different lens. Most Northerners felt it was a potent military weapon. So even most Northerners do jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, this is the right thing. We're trying to end the war. I mean, this is going to hurt the South more than anything else. That's what we want. Abolitionists felt it should have expanded to include slavery everywhere, right? So you still have those William Lloyd Garrison types, still carry that sort of torch that, immediate abolition of everyone under slavery everywhere, okay? Lincoln's always believed in gradual emancipation, though. That's something new. Many freedmen wore a uniform, joined the war effort, so this is paying dividends on the battlefield. Afterwards, right, as an impact, Southern government would label a white officer of black troops as a leader of the slave rebellion. So they're not treating white officers and black troops as soldiers. There's no POW. There's no war tribunals. There's none of that kind of stuff. They're looked at as leaders of slave rebellion. There's nothing different between this and Nat Turner's rebellion, for example, okay, or the Stonewall Rebellion. Take it back even further. So these are looked at exactly the same as those events we discussed earlier, and were treated in the same way. Black troops were given no quarter by white Confederates. All right, so you think of certain instances, certain battles like Poison Springs, Arkansas, where surrendering black troops would just be gunned down the battlefield. They'd be murdered. Okay, that's where war just becomes murder. Okay, in this case, received unequal pay and treatment relative to their white counterparts. That is something that Lincoln himself actually defends. It's tough to think of that, right? And all we know about Lincoln today, but he defends that for a variety of reasons. But In Great Britain, all slavery had been abolished 30 years before this or so. So while they still see this sort of a half measure, it's not really, it's sort of halfway being done. They do see that the support for the North over the South is just more imminent to them. So after Antietam, and the French and the British generally decline any alliance, any thought of an alliance with the South. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, their being neutral really becomes the idea. Okay, they're going to stay out of this, is basically the idea. So there was a time when the British may have helped the Confederacy, we said, because of their cotton, but they never would have aided them in their cause of slavery. So now the North has at least put a stamp on this war, as it says here at the bottom, as I typed here, is that ultimately now preserving the Union and freeing the slaves, and freeing the slaves became a part of the same cause, right? So they're tied together now, which is important. So just to kind of give it some connection to some earlier events in American history, in much the same way the Declaration of Independence had changed and given direction to the Revolutionary War, the Emancipation Proclamation does this for the Civil War. So this is a big turning point for the Civil War, and starts to define what the Union North is fighting for. And it kind of goes back to the cultural aspect of the South, Southern civilization versus Northern civilization, and kind of how we began the first of these three screencasts. So keep that in the back of your mind.